Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Henry and I was a site supervisor at Mission Viejo High School in 2013. Today we're going to be talking about foreign policy and international relations. Now before we start, I'd like to preface this discussion by saying that what you're going to be learning today is just a foundation for your future learning. So a lot of the concepts, the theories, the case studies that we're going to be talking about are just very basic and they'll serve as a base for you to jump off into future learning. I'd also like to start with a review of nations, nation-states, multinational states, and states. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, so you can get a better idea of that. Okay, so you may have learned already about states, nations, nation-states, and multinational states. These are very key concepts in foreign policy and international relations and many other subfields such as many other fields such as political science or economics. A state is a territorial entity and it encompasses a certain geographical area. So a very good example of a state would be the United States of America, Vatican City, or the United Kingdom. A nation is a cultural or ethnic entity. It's basically just a large group of people that identify with each other because of their shared religion, language, customs, whatever it may be. It's not the same as a state because it's not a political entity. So an example or examples of nations would be the Cherokee Nation, Kurdistan, or Scotland, which is within the United Kingdom. A nation-state is when a state and a nation are combined. So basically when a nation also has a state, to put it more simply. So if you look at the maps to your right, you can see that there is a map of the United Kingdom and there's a map of Ireland. As you can see at the top of that map, Scotland is part of the UK. However, it's not the same as England. The United Kingdom is made up of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. As you can see on the map, that's all under the Union Jack flag. So that's a state, that's a political entity, and it encompasses several different nations or ethnicities. And there are actually movements within Scotland to actually separate from the United Kingdom and form their own state. On the bottom right, you can see a map of Kurdistan. Now, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but that red area is where there are a majority of Kurds living in that area. And this red area is actually within the borders of several states: Syria, Iran, Iraq, Turkey. And so there are also movements within Kurdistan to separate from these states and create their own nation state so that they can be ruled by a majority Kurd government. A multinational state is when a state has multiple nations within it. Once again, we go back to that example of the United Kingdom. We have England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Within the United States, we are to an extent a multinational state as well because we have multiple ethnic groups living in them that have a lot of representation. So let's jump into foreign policy. Foreign policy is just basically a set of strategies that states use to interact with other states and non-state actors. We use the chess analogy at the very beginning of the title page because in some ways it's very strategic. If you've ever played chess, you have to sort of calculate what your opponent will make, what moves your opponent will make in several steps ahead. If you've never played chess, just think of it as a very strategic game. Foreign policy has three main characteristics that we'll talk about today. First of all, it's usually created by the head of a government, the executive. In the US, that's Barack Obama. And the executive usually has the help of a foreign minister. In the United States, we have the Secretary of State. However, although foreign policy is strategic, usually it's not always a strategic calculation. Because foreign policy is created by individuals, these individuals are humans, and humans are prey to human emotions and thoughts of morality and things like that. So it's not always a straight strategic calculation about what would be best in the next however many moves forward. It also overlaps with domestic policy, and that's the third characteristic that I was going to mention. Examples of that would be the war on drugs. So even though the war on drugs in the US is sort of a domestic policy aimed at curtailing the use of narcotics in the United States, a lot of that requires going into Mexico, going into Colombia, working with those governments to stop the flow of drugs flowing into North America, into the United States. The global war on terror is another example. Although national security is to an extent a domestic policy, that requires us to oftentimes go overseas. Afghanistan is an example of how domestic policy, such as national security, went overseas into foreign policy. A lot of this is also a result of globalization. As we've talked about in many times during your classes, globalization has essentially reduced the power of national borders. In some ways, it has shrunk the world and brought everyone closer together. So any problems that a country is having within its borders many times affects other countries in different ways. So that's the what of foreign policy. Now let's talk about the who. So who creates foreign policy? We talked about in the United States how the President, Barack Obama, creates foreign policy usually and is aided by the Secretary of State, John Kerry. The Secretary of State is a cabinet official within the presidency who oversees the State Department. Now, the State Department is a separate organization within the US government that controls embassies and controls the diplomats that we have in foreign countries. If you've ever been overseas, you can often go to a US embassy if you lost your passport or if you're being followed by criminals or anything of that kind. The US Embassy is there for US citizens abroad and looks after the interests of US citizens. So Hillary Clinton, who was the former Secretary of State, said that foreign policy of the United States is built on 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. So keep that in mind when we go into some of our concepts and theories in the future. So now that we've talked about the who and the what of foreign policy, we have to think about why. Why does a state pursue a particular goal in foreign policy? That's a very, very confusing concept at times, and it's so complex that there's actually an entire field dedicated to studying foreign policy, and that field is called international relations. International relations is the study of how states and non-state actors interact on the global stage. In other words, it's the study of foreign policy. International relations as a field is often used to analyze and formulate a state's foreign policy. It's comprised of many, many different concepts and theories because no one can really agree on why people are doing certain things. And it also tries to explain why a state and non-state actor may pursue a particular goal. So we're going to be talking about some of the very basic concepts and theories in this PowerPoint. The first one being the national interest. So one reason why a state may pursue a particular goal in foreign policy is to follow its national interest, which is a highly debated concept that guides a country's military, economic, and political goals. And so because it's so subjective, it's highly debated. In the US Congress, for example, we can argue that most, or if not all, representatives and senators are looking out for the best interest of the American citizens, of the United States as a whole. But the idea of what is the best interest of the United States and how to go about it is why foreign policy and international relations is very complex. It's also constantly changing. In the Cold War era, there was this theory of containment in the United States, where the main goal of the United States was to contain the spread of communism into other countries, because it was seen as an opposing force to capitalism and democracy in an extension. After the Cold War, there was the global war on terror, which was really created by September 11th and those terrorist attacks in 2001. And finally, there's the pivot to Asia, which is sort of a more recent development. If you've been following the news in the past few years, Obama has been talking about sort of withdrawing more of our troops from the Middle East and turning more toward Asia, which is becoming a very important economic location. There are also a lot of contradictory interests if we talk about national interest. So everyone would like security, everyone would also like personal freedom. However, sometimes those two are mutually exclusive. Not always, but sometimes. So an example would be the NSA surveillance programs. Some argue that those surveillance programs protect the American people from future terrorist attacks. Others say that it's a violation of personal liberties. So which one is more important? Where's the balance? That's a really big discussion. So a country can usually pursue its national interests in 2 main ways, according to international relations theory. There's hard power, which is using military strength or economic incentives to directly coerce another country into a desired course of action. And so the key words here are directly coerce. So we're a country using hard power is essentially forcing another country to do something that it normally wouldn't do. And they can do this using two main methods. And they're broken down into carrots and sticks. So carrots are foreign aid, removing trade barriers like economic sanctions or tariffs. Also the promise of military protection. So if the US promises Japan that it will protect it from any future conflict, that in a way is a carrot, which is hard power. There are also sticks, which are much more direct. Sticks are military force, economic sanctions, coercive diplomacy, essentially using muscle to muscle your way into forcing someone to do something. So if you look in those political cartoons on the right-hand side of the slide, you could see that there is one where Obama and Hillary are repainting their sticks into carrots. And that political cartoonist was basically saying that the US is changing foreign policy from being more aggressive to being slightly more, well, not necessarily less aggressive, but it's changing its policy from sticks to carrots, meaning it's looking into economic incentives like foreign aid instead of just using military force, for example. Okay, so now I'll give you a couple examples of hard power, and you can discuss amongst yourselves for each one and determine whether they are an example of a carrot or a stick. The first one is Operation Desert Storm, and I'll give you some background. In 1991, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait for a host of reasons. Now, the international community was upset with this, and the US was able to lead a coalition of military forces to push Iraq out of Kuwait and destroy their army militarily. Now, is this an example of a carrot or a stick? So that was a pretty easy one. That was clearly a stick because we're using direct military power to destroy the Iraqi army and to push them out of Kuwait. Now, how about something a little bit less clear? How about US sanctions against Iran? Now that's hard power because we're harming Iran by banning or embargoing certain goods flowing in and out of them. And the reason why we're doing this is, for some background, is because Iran has been trying to pursue a nuclear program. And so Iran claims that this nuclear program is for civilian uses, to create nuclear power at nuclear reactors. However, the US and the international community argues that this nuclear program could be used to create nuclear weapons, which would be a big problem. So the US embargoed Iranian goods and did not allow certain countries to export to Iran. And this is harming Iran. So what do you think? Is it a carrot or a stick? So that was another example of a stick. Even though it's not military power that the US is using, this economic sanction is still hurting Iran and is still a direct coercion. So, what about US military aid to Pakistan, or even Egypt for something a little bit more relevant to what's going on in the news today? So, think about it. Is it a carrot or a stick? Now, this is a prime example of a carrot. The US is giving military aid to Pakistan with strings attached, basically saying that they have to allow us to do certain things within their country, or they have to do certain things for us as well. This could be several things like allowing our trade routes to go through Pakistan into Afghanistan to fight our war there, or allowing us to fly drones into certain territories. So this military aid with strings attached is an example of a carrot. Can you think of some other examples of carrots and sticks? So let's move on to soft power. Soft power is a relatively new term, and it was coined by Joseph Nye in 2004. And Joseph Nye is a very famous political scientist and international relations scholar. And he said it this way: there are three ways you can get countries to do something for you. You can threaten them with sticks, you can bribe them with carrots, or you can attract them with your soft power. And so soft power is the ability to indirectly influence other countries through cultural and ideological means. So the key operating terms here, once again, are indirectly influence. Now, if you contrast that with hard power is the ability to directly coerce countries. So examples of how to indirectly influence countries would be some of the cartoons on your left. You can see on the bottom left, there is a man playing a piano, and he's essentially charming the world with his music. And that's a cultural export into the world that allows other countries and other people living in other countries to relate to where that export is coming from. So I'll give you a couple examples of soft power, actually several examples. On the top left of the slide, there is a Japanese man with denim. So what's very interesting is that there is a prefecture in Japan called the Okayama Prefecture that's famous for the denim it produces. Denim as in blue jeans or whatever color jeans you like. And denim is actually an American export. Blue jeans is sort of a symbol of Americanism. But the Japanese have taken to this so much that they've actually purchased a lot of looms from the US and have begun to create very, very high quality denim. And there's sort of this denim obsession in Japan. And this also translates into other things like Red Wing boots, which is from Minnesota. There are a lot of Asian countries that actually really like US made workwear. And that's, a cultural export from the US to these Asian countries. On the bottom left, this is the reverse. You have Totoro, which is a Japanese anime. I don't know if many of you have seen it, but when I was a child, it was very popular. And I remember watching it back when I was in Hong Kong and also when I was in America. So I thought it was incredibly entertaining, and it helped me identify more with Japanese culture. In the middle, you have Jimi Hendrix, who's a very famous American guitarist. On the bottom, I hope you know that those are the Beatles on Abbey Road. That's a British export. On the right of the middle, you have a Saudi McDonald's, and McDonald's is an American multinational corporation that has many branches all across the world. And anytime someone eats at McDonald's, they're eating an American export. And to an extent, that helps them relate to Americanism, or to America, essentially. On the top right, you have a very famous Korean drama called Winter Sonata. And Korean dramas have become very popular recently. A lot of people have begun watching them, not just in the US, but in China, in Japan, and basically all across the world. And that is a way that the Korean culture is being exported to the world. On the bottom right, you have students from the University of Nairobi who are learning how to make dumplings from the Chinese at this Confucius Institute that was set up in Kenya. So once again, an example of Chinese soft power in Africa. So now that we've talked about some of the main international relations concepts, let's talk about two very fundamental theories. Now, it's very important to understand that these two theories are not the only theories in international relations. There are several theories. We can go into a long list, such as constructivism, Marxism, post-colonialism, but that's a little bit too complex. For now, let's stick to some of the basic ones, and there are two. Those two are realism and liberalism. Now let's start with realism first. Thucydides, who was an Athenian historian, wrote in the History of the Peloponnesian War that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And so this is a result of the international system being anarchic, according to realists. And so because the international system is anarchic and there is complete chaos, states have to survive somehow, and the way they do it is by maximizing their power relative to other states. And so let's break that down. The key concepts being, one, that the international system is chaotic inherently and can't be non-chaotic. There's no order to it that can be created. And two, that states are primarily concerned with survival. That is their main national interest. They want to survive in the international system. Three, states are the most important actors. IGOs, NGOs, or IGOs being things like the UN, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs being non-governmental organizations, or MNCs such as corporations, they don't play as much of a role. It's really states that do all of this foreign policy decision making, and they are concerned with their survival. And as a result of all of this, states are forced to maximize their power in order to survive. And there's this concept called self-help. States can't rely on any other states, they can only rely on themselves, so therefore they should maximize their military power because that's the most reliable form of power. Now, to contrast this, liberalism says that you can actually achieve peace and prosperity through institution building. This is different from political realism, just to let you know. Political liberalism is just the idea that there are civil liberties and personal freedoms that are at stake in a government. International relations liberalism is more about how, even though the international system may be chaotic, it can be managed peacefully if states cooperate and create strong institutions such as the United Nations, such as the International Atomic Energy Association, and they have very concrete rules to follow. So, if we contrast these key terms or these key points with the key points that I listed in realism, we can see that in realism, realists say that the international system is inherently chaotic and that can't be fixed. Liberalists say that the international system may be chaotic, but it can be fixed. In realism, states are primarily concerned with their survival. In liberalism, states may be concerned with other things besides survival. There are potentially moral obligations. There are other considerations at stake. In realism, states are the primary actors. In liberalism, IGOs such as the UN play a very important role. NGOs such as the Red Cross do as well. MNCs such as McDonald's may have a very important role to play as well. In realism, states must rely on themselves, and that, once again, is the concept of self-help. In liberalism, states can all benefit from cooperation and interdependence. So to give you an example, consider there is an apple tree that only has 10 apples. So realists say that the world is zero-sum, meaning that anytime someone else gains, you essentially lose. So in a realist world, someone who picks 5 apples and eats those apples, that would mean that you have 5 fewer apples to eat, and therefore you have a higher chance of starving, and so you should be worried. You should try to get those apples as quickly as you can. Whereas in liberalism, if you work together, you may be able to actually share those apples, grow new plants, and actually increase the gains for everyone. So these concepts are usually not followed in their pure forms. Very rarely are people purely realist and purely liberal. A lot of times there's a mixture of this, but there is a certain leaning toward one school of thought or another school of thought. In recent times, there are other concepts such as neoliberalism or neo-realism as well. Those, once again, are slightly more complex concepts that you can study if you find this an interesting field. Now that you've learned some of the basic concepts and theories of international relations, we can sort of apply this to analyze certain foreign policies. So we'll have a brief case study of what's going on in the East China Sea. If you've been following the news, the East China Sea is a source of a lot of disputes between Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China. So in this case study, we're going to be focusing on one particular island chain called the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands in China. So Japan calls it the Senkaku Islands, China calls it Diaoyu. So to give you some background, there have been a lot of recent military buildups in the region. Or there's also a history of animosities because of World War II. If you haven't studied World War II, just very basically, Japan sought to colonize a lot of the East Asian region, and China was a victim of some of this. And so there's a very painful history between a lot of these countries. There's also a lot of latent nationalism in Japan and China. Nationalism being this very strong pride for one's country and for one's ethnicity. Finally, there's also an economic incentive, possibly, the presence of oil and natural gas in the region. So very recently, there have been a lot of very strong protests in Japan and China over these islands. Technically, Japan owns the islands, but China claims it under international law. So, or according to their international law, their version of international law, excuse me. So on the top left corner of the screen, you can see that there are Japanese protesters, and it gets a lot more violent than that. There's like burning of Chinese flags and such. On the bottom left, you can see Chinese protesters. On the top right, there is a Chinese ship with activists on it going to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, trying to drop off activists to wave flags and protest on the islands themselves. And there are 2 Japanese naval vessels that are basically intercepting it by, I guess, pinning them together, oddly enough. On the bottom right, there is a more violent Chinese protest where they're burning a Japanese flag. And so we have to as foreign policy experts, we have to look into this and say, what are some of the historical, political, social, and economic factors involved? These are very important considerations when we're thinking about why a country might be pursuing a particular goal, beyond just the basic concepts of national interest and hard power, soft power, realism, liberalism. Just the very basics are, what are some of the historical factors involved? What do China and Japan seek to gain from all of this? This is actually called stakeholder analysis. What do these countries have at stake, and why are they doing this? Is it because of what they have at stake? So why are these islands also being claimed as a national interest? Are they really a national interest, do you think? What might an international relations realist say about the military buildups in the region? The Chinese military buildup, which has been increasing over the years, has been, to an extent, threatening to its neighbors in Korea and Japan. To a certain degree, Japan has also responded by building up its military. In international relations theory, this is actually called a security dilemma. You'll learn about that in the future if you decide to pursue this field. And how might IGOs and NGOs be part of this? And do you think they are actually a part of this whole conflict? Do you think that IGOs, such as the United Nations or other multilateral organizations in Asia, or NGOs, could actually play a part in maybe moderating the stances of these countries, or maybe even increasing the fervor of the nationalistic fervor in these countries? Finally, you have to ask yourselves, what is the likelihood of conflict in the East Asian region? Although there are a lot of incentives, such as the economic incentives or the national pride at stake, there's an argument that there's a lot of economic interdependence in East Asia. So do you think that the national pride and the economic incentives are overpowering the economic interdependence? That might be more of a realist view or a liberal view. That's for you to decide. So what do you think? Finally, we have some other scenarios to consider. We can use our basic understanding of foreign policy to think about some other situations that are very pertinent to today's news. So, for example, should the US intervene in the Syrian civil war? Do we have something at stake? What about the morality of it? Should we intervene? Why does China support the North Korean regime? This is a very commonly asked question. What do you think China's national interest is in supporting the regime? Is there an economic reason? Is there a social reason, a historical, political reason? How might it support its regime? Through hard power or soft power? And what motivated the 2003 US invasion of Iraq? And there are official reasons why, but a lot of people debate about why the US really invaded Iraq and why the international community sort of allowed this to happen. Finally, I want to summarize by saying that you can use these very basic concepts and theories as a foundation if you decide to pursue this field in the future. Political science, foreign policy, international relations are very interesting fields, and if you decide you want to work for the government or want to work for a think tank or some other organization to analyze what countries are doing and why they're doing them, this could be a very interesting field for you to pursue. And these theories will serve as a springboard for you to go and do that. However, if you're not interested in that, these theories can also be very helpful for you in your normal personal life. If you think about foreign policy and how it's a set of strategies to interact with other states, you can bring that down to a microcosmic level and think about your own interpersonal relations. On your day-to-day activities, when you interact with your teacher, with your friends, with strangers, with your parents, you go through a lot of these considerations that states go through when they interact. So do you think that the world is a little bit more realist? Is it more realist? Is it more realist? Is it more liberal? What do you think? Do you think that you can use hard power to explain some of the concepts that are occurring or explain some of the events that are occurring in school? So next time you see a school bully, is he using hard power or soft power, carrots or sticks? So that's some way that you can actually apply these ideas to your interpersonal lives. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your site supervisors or your interns. I'm sure they'll be able to clear up some of these concepts. And hopefully this video was very educational and interesting to you. Thank you very much.